Thanks, everyone. So, right. 300 years ago, a piece of legislation revolutionized the lives of writers. It transformed them from penniless hacks to professional men. It transported them from Grub Street to, well, relatively easy street. Its name was the Statute of Anne, and it gave shape to the concept that we today understand as copyright. And this is defined as the legal right to control the production and selling of a book, play, film, photograph, or piece of music. The Act was subtitled An Act for the Encouragement of Learning. And if we put this together with our definition of copyright, we essentially end up with two things. We end up with a motive and a mechanism. The motive of Anne was to enable authors to profit from their work, and by enabling them to do so, to encourage them to make more. And the mechanism that was put in place to facilitate this was putting control over the copying of their work back into their hands. Up to this point, it had been exploited by manipulative publishers. And for several hundred years, the system worked pretty well and ushered in a great age of writers, among them Daniel Defoe, Alexander Pope, and of course, Dr. Johnson, who famously remarked, "No man but a blockhead ever wrote, except for money." Yes, okay, some work was still copied without the author's consent, mainly in lawless, backward places like America. But by and large, enough was produced legitimately to enable writers for the first time to make a living from their intellectual property. And soon enough, even women were doing it. This is Jane Austen looking very determined. But then along came the internet, and what up to this point had been quite a small problem became a much, much bigger one. Why was this the case? Because essentially copying lies at the heart of what the internet is and what it does. You could say that it's defined by its ability to be all things to all men at all times. Suddenly, copying things had become much, much easier, and the idea of trying to stop people copying started to look less effective. And it didn't seem so crazy to start asking questions like, does copyright have a place in a digital world? And in trying to answer this question, the dominant rhetoric so far has been about this word, control. If we go back to this mechanism motive idea, we focus so far very much on mechanism. The big questions that we've asked so far are, how do we stop people copying, rather than what are we doing it for? And this has been the case in legislation as well. Here in the UK, the Digital Economy Act 2010 passed last year, but now under judicial review, interestingly enough, was very much predicated on this idea of trying to control copying, that it could and should be limited. But what if this is the wrong question? What if we're taking the wrong approach on this? Is there another way of addressing this question? And really, sort of, this is where we're at now. If we think about the internet, we can see it as a giant conversation, and as such, an environment almost ideally suited to enabling authors to do what they do best, to communicate. As one of the most successful writers living today, says Paulo Coelho, said, "An author wants his work to be read. He wants to be part of the conversation, and ideally, he wants everyone to be talking about him." And the internet gives writers an almost sort of unparalleled opportunity to engage not just with their readers and sort of potential consumers, but also with each other, to participate in creative exchange across borders, across disciplines, through a host of different channels. And these are, this is the thin end of the wedge. So far, so good, you would think. But, there's always a but. The quid pro quo for this increased connectivity is a decrease in the amount of control we have over how information and, crucially, content is disseminated and spread. And for content producers for whom this is their living, this is a pretty scary prospect. especially if you rely on this equation, cost equals value. And the assumption that arises from this is that if you allow content to be free, it becomes valueless. But if we look at the evidence for this, it suggests that the picture is much more complicated than this simple equation initially implies. If we take some examples, the author Neil Gaiman recently made his work available for free online through his website. And a month later, his sales had increased 300%, particularly actually in countries where piracy was most prevalent. This is a classic example of disintermediation, this idea of cutting out the middleman and going straight to the core. And if we take this idea a little further, it's something that you would assume would have a negative effect on traditional channels, the old structures, publishers, who always used to sort of manage this gap between creator and consumer. But in the same week that a 26-year-old became a millionaire self-publishing through Kindle, two large traditional publishers published end-of-year results which showed significant profits. If we look at the world of print journalism, just as the New York Times announced plans to go behind a paywall, the Huffington Post, an online open access site, free content, was sold to AOL for $315 million. So what conclusions can we draw from what are apparently conflicting examples? Well, perhaps that the biggest challenge the digital revolution offers is to the way we frame the debate altogether. That in a digital world, there doesn't need to be just one success story. There can be many. That the crucial word here is and rather than or. And if we use the analogy of a forest, the sort of the big hitters, the superstars and the sort of bestsellers are still very much there. But there's a lot more sort of rustling around in the undergrowth than there used to be. And these new business models, which are doing the rustling, can survive with far fewer resources than the taller trees can. So you end up with this scenario where there's a sort of much more sort of grassroots action going on. And so it seems from this that we can start to question this rather negative rhetoric of control that's been dominating talk about this area so far, and reach for a more sort of inclusive rhetoric of capability and capacity. If we go back to the Statute of Anne, where we started, and think about this dyad of mechanism and motive, the motive is very clearly still there. We still want to recognize and reward our creators for their content. But the original mechanism that was put in place to give effect to that motive is now just one part of a much bigger picture. Copyright is only part of the answer today. And what this sort of huge expansion in the market has really brought about is enabling us to move away from this idea of a sort of holy grail of content distribution and towards a model where there are multiple business models making money from content, yes, from straightforward sale, but also from a whole host of other sources, from subscription services, from added value, advertising is obviously a big one, events, apps, merchandise. What seems pretty clear at the moment is that all content producers are likely to see diversification in the way that they monetize their content, and that the business models which deliver that content will diversify too. The ways that they'll change, so coming back to our theme, they're likely to be smaller, more agile, more specialized. If I steal Jeff Jarvis's advice, do what you do best and link to the rest. As these traditional boundaries between creators and consumers, distributors and producers break down, we're likely to see that they'll be more hybrid, more collaborative, bringing together professionals and amateurs, individuals and communities. And we're seeing this already in the music industry, but also other industries. We're getting platforms popping up all over the place, working on a perks for pledges basis. So you pledge however much money you want to give in return for a perk of your choice, whether that's a free copy of a book or concert tickets. So if we come back to Anne, which is where we started and sort of is framing this whole debate, that 300-year-old motive, the desire to recognize and reward creative output, is still alive and thriving. But the mechanism is changing hugely, sort of faster than we can really keep track of. But amidst all this change, there are some constants that we can keep hold of, things which retain their value, which can't be copied, and which are likely to continue to define the way we consume content in the future. And I've identified some of these. So the first one is premium. In an environment where everything is essentially a copy, and those copies are increasingly free, we will pay more for premium copies, for the special editions, the rare, the original. Personalization. Faced with this almost bewildering, often bewildering array of content, the services which cater for our particular needs, our specific interests, will become even more valuable than ever. Patronage. This is coming back to this perks for a pledge idea. Now you don't have to be a wealthy philanthropist to buy into an idea. You can do it to the tune of a book or a record. Proximity. We always want to get closer to our favorite artists or our favorite writers, hopefully not too close. Priority. We'll want their latest book, their latest record first. Peace of mind. Knowing that the content that we do have is safe, is reliable, bug-free. Omnipresence. Having it everywhere we want, however we want it, whenever we want it. And crucially, last but not least, the company of our peers. We'll want to be part of communities of like-minded individuals whose opinions we value, whose ideas we admire. And that, of course, is why we're all here tonight. It's what TED's about, it's what tonight's about. Thanks very much.